Welcome to Discipleship Distinctives. My name's Dave Newton, and in this session, together with Dr. Neil Hudson, we will be exploring discipleship in an Elim context. There won't be many of us who would deny our mandate as Christians to make disciples. Equally, I doubt there'll be many who were surprised when Elim announced making disciples as one of its key strategic priorities. But what does it mean to be a disciple? And how do we follow in the ways of Jesus and help others to do the same? Today, I want to invite you on a journey to take even more seriously the disciple-making priority. Not just for you personally, but in your context and throughout your church. Over a year ago, a discipleship task force was set up, and as a result of this conversation, we commissioned a piece of research to look into 16 of our healthy Elim churches to see which principles could be drawn out that would help us consider how we can make disciples. In a moment, I'm going to invite Neil to share the findings of this research for the first time in such a public setting. After that, myself and Neil will have a discussion and dialogue around some of the significant areas that came out from this particular research, looking at what impact it could have on our Elim churches and the church as a whole in the UK. Feel free to comment, feel free to join in the conversation. It's so worth staying tuned in. So, over to you, Neil.
Well, as Dave said, today's seminar really is linked to one of Elim's 4 strategic priorities, that of making disciples. Whenever you begin to address this, to think through, well, what does it mean to enable one another to grow as disciples of Jesus? We need to understand, well, what is a disciple? Because it can range from a number of things. For some people, it's like A-level Christianity. It's like for the really keen Christians, most people just think, no, I'm just a sort of GCSE type. For other people, it's a course that you do, perhaps after you've done Alpha. And for others, it's about a lifelong following of Jesus, something that I would feel much more comfortable with. In fact, I think that a good definition of what a disciple is someone who's learning the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. And so what we set out to do in doing some research with Elim was to ask, well, what sort of churches create that sort of people? What do we do together in our gathered life that enable us to live really faithfully and well in our scattered lives? And so we undertook some research. We haven't really historically done that much research in Elim, not with surveys and focus groups and that sort of thing. And for some people, it's like, oh, that's brilliant, a little bit of research, let's get some figures. And for others people, it's like, no, just tell us the headlines. Well, in a sense, what I want to do in the time I have with you here is do a little bit of both. What we did was we were given 16 churches, healthy churches, well-led churches, churches that are growing, because what we wanted to do is find out what good practice looked like in those places. We interviewed the leaders, we went to some of the Sunday gatherings, we brought together little focus groups so we could just interrogate the survey a little bit more and find out a little bit more information. And then we asked 800 plus people to fill out a survey. It equated to about 20% of the whole of the number of people in those churches. So this doesn't tell us everything about Elim, but it tells us something about some of the churches that are part of our movement and what they've discovered. And perhaps most importantly, this isn't about the pastors saying this is what we do. This is actually about the voice of folks on the receiving end, if you will, the people who are being shaped as disciples in those contexts. There's much that I could have shared from the research, but actually there's 3 areas that I want to highlight in the time we have together. 3 issues that were raised, 3 challenges that it suggests, and hopefully 3 areas that are worth pursuing further. The first was the significance of small groups. When we asked people, What feeds into your spiritual life? What allows you to grow as a Christian? The vast majority of people said, actually, we prioritize coming to church on Sunday morning. Now, whether you meet on a Sunday or whether you meet elsewhere, and whether it's a morning or an evening, it really doesn't matter. But they prioritize the gathering. Over half of the folks who answered that question said, actually, we're part of small groups. It's quite interesting because when we dug a little deeper into that, what we discovered is that most people said, actually, I'm not sure Sunday is primarily about being discipled. Sundays and the times when we're together, certainly times of celebration, there's certainly like an oasis in the week. It's where we're refreshed and we find peace and strength. We're anchored again in our faith. It's certainly a place where we meet and we fellowship with one another. We support one another. We're encouraged and empowered. And it's certainly a place where we learn. And when we sort of prodded a little bit further, we said, well, which parts of your gathering really enable you to live as well as disciples? They said, actually, probably the preaching. It prompts us to act. It equips us. It gives us confidence. And it inspires when it's earthed in everyday examples of what it means to be faithful to Jesus in a world like our own. But what was interesting was they went on to talk about the significance of the stories they hear. The stories they hear mostly are in the context of celebration about people being saved or miracles happening, and they find those inspiring. But actually, stories really count when it's about more than just the big story. It's about when people are allowed to get to know one another a little better, when they sense that it helps them see God better. It reawakens their imagination about what God might be doing and indeed might want to do on an ongoing basis. And it gives examples of God being at work. And there's a strong view across all of the people that we surveyed that actually they would love to hear more stories. Which led us to the questions about small groups, because of course those are the places where you're most likely to hear the stories of God at work. Home groups, life groups, huddles, missional communities, they're named all sorts of things. But actually what people were saying is that they felt that the best practices were when everyone were encouraged to be in a group. In other words, small groups wasn't just for the keen Christians or as a sort of an alternative option for church life, but actually was a core part of church life. They felt it was where there wasn't too much prescription. There was an ability to be flexible, to respond to time, place, and the personalities involved. Quite interestingly, people said, don't make the studies too difficult, because sometimes some people said we feel disempowered when actually the questions are just too difficult and we feel stupid. And give us a mix of people. Don't give us people just like us. Allow us to share with others. When we were doing the research, it was really interesting because we had the opportunity to see a case study in action, because there was a church in Northern Ireland that hadn't had small groups for quite a while, and now they were going back in to using small groups in their church. And so we heard from people who'd engaged with that about what it was like for them. And this is what they said. Prior to life groups, apart from your immediate circle of family or friends, I wouldn't have known what was going on in other people's everyday life. I'm not sure how much of an impact that had on a day-to-day, weekly basis. And we said, well, how does your church connect with your everyday life? And they said, well, it connects quite a bit for us. More because we've gone through these last 5 weeks of small groups. Prior to that, I would have said maybe not so much. We felt maybe it didn't connect as much as it does now through life groups. Sharing our experiences together, day-to-day life, and the challenges that we face, it has. And we asked about the relationship between their groups and discipleship. And the person said previously it was up to the individual, whereas now, the way the groups have been formed, you find this is how we're going to bring you in as a disciple. Before it was up to the individual. Kind of interesting that what was going on where people were saying these small groups enable us to connect our lives together. It creates a context for community. It enables us to work out what discipleship looks like. It connects the teaching of the church with our experience of being a Christian, and it makes us accountable. Someone in Halifax said this: the Freedom in the Christ course has been life-changing. I've been a Christian a long, long time, but this last year, it's like proper discipleship, learning who I am and my role. I've fretted about things for years, and I don't need to. I just need to be the best wife I can be, the best mum I can be, the best colleague. I don't need to be constantly trying to be somebody else. Now, I'm just me. I'm more relaxed. I feel I know who I am, where before I struggled. For the first time, I fully understand who I am in Christ. I know what my purpose is. Wow. So my first finding was that actually home groups are not primarily simply about fellowship. It's not just a place to be cared for. It's a place where actually you connect the teaching with real life. It's the place where you find out your purpose in life. It's the place where you're held accountable. They're significant. And I know it's difficult to encourage people to be part of small group because we're busy and we've got everything else going on in our lives. But actually, if we want to grow, people would testify themselves that actually being part of a small group, vital to their growth as Christians. My second issue that I want to raise is about the significance of missional connections. We ask people, where do you spend most of your time in a typical week? And unsurprisingly, by far, most people said actually home or work. And then we asked, who do you spend time with? And perhaps more sobering, around 45% of people said, well, actually, I spend most of my time with Christians. For some of those people, they said, nearly all my time I spend with other Christians. But then we said, well, where do you meet non-Christians most? Where are you most likely to encounter non-Christians? And half of them said, without a shadow of a doubt, the workplace. There's lots I could say about this, but there's just one thing I'd want to say. The workplace, for folks in our churches, is the number one primary place for mission. It's a place where you work alongside non-Christians. It's a place where you serve non-Christians. It's a place where you share your life with non-Christians. It's a place where you witness to Christ. In the way you work, in your attitude to work, in your attitude to your employer and your employee, your attitude to your fellow worker, the things you say, the things you don't say, the actions you take, the actions you don't take. Your primary place of mission is your workplace. I wonder what that means for our life as church together. I wonder what it means for our equipping, for our teaching program, for our training program, for the place where we imagine all of this is going to be applied. I would suggest the workplace holds the key. And then there was a third area. Now, sometimes when you do research, you kind of know what you might find. You sometimes do research in order to prove what you always have had a hunch about. But in doing research, every now and again, you come up with something that you didn't expect to find, because actually it only became apparent when you started to look through the results of the research as a whole. And certainly this final part of the research falls into that category. And it was about the significance of purpose in spiritual growth. It's one of those things that, you know, when you see things and you go, oh yeah, it's obvious. I've just never really thought about it like that. But now you tell me, of course, I know. Well, for me, that definitely fell into this category. There was a part of the research when we asked people, how clear are you about God's purposes for you at this point in your life? In other words, do you know what God's asking of you with clarity right now here in your place? And overall, as you can see from the graph, about a third said, yeah, we're really clear. And about a third-ish said, not so sure. And about a third said, not at all. Now, some of you will be optimists and you'll go, well, hey, 2/3 are either very sure or pretty sure. And to be honest, that's pretty good. But think about the other third. Think about any congregation that you are a part of or that you lead. If you knew 1/3 of people were sitting in front of you going, I really don't know what my purpose is in life, that would cause you some concern, wouldn't it? If you knew that out of the 800 plus people that we surveyed, about 280 of them sitting there going, I don't really know why I'm here, that's a bit of a concern. Now, it changes at different points of life, and you might expect that, but it's really still quite sobering, I think. We asked people to explain how they would describe themselves as Christians, and it was really interesting that the top 5 descriptions that they made on themselves were thankful, learning, hopeful, and challenged. And actually, it made no difference whether you were really clear about your purpose or not clear at all. You still would say you're thankful. And there's part of me that goes, isn't that brilliant? That actually we're a thankful people. We're grateful to God. We're thankful for what he's done in our lives. We're thankful for the people that God has given us. And it really doesn't matter whether you're very clear about purpose or not at all. But look at what happens when other words are included. If you're really clear about your purpose, half of the respondents said, over half, I'm joyful. Whereas only 1/3 were joyful if they didn't know what the purpose was. And similar with peaceful and faith-filled and purposeful and fruitful. Look at fruitful. Are you bearing fruit as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus? And those who said, I really know what my purpose is, about half of them said, yeah, I think I am. And if you weren't, only about 17% said, yeah. Well, it's kind of not surprising, isn't it? If you know what your purpose is, then it's clear what fruitfulness might look like there. If you're not, then you might not be quite so sure. What's the implication of that? Well, one of the things is that you might go through much of your Christian life going, I don't know if my life matters to God. I don't know if I'm playing my part. I don't know if this counts. And pastorally, it matters. Only 8% of people who knew what their purpose was described themselves as anxious. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Whereas 1/4 of people who said, I don't know what my purpose is, said, actually, I am actually quite anxious. Now, these people are from the same churches. These people sit side by side. So what's the difference between those who are anxious and those who aren't? What's the difference between those who say, those very few people actually, who say, actually, I feel like I'm stuck in my Christian life at the moment, and those who go, I'm really stuck? Only 8% of those who said, I know my purpose, felt stuck. Whereas 1/4 of people who don't know what their purpose is went, I'm stuck. Now, I'm a pastor, and I think this may well be true in my own church. And it made me think about pastoral issues that sometimes we face with people. You get anxious people, and when anxious people face new situations or changes happen, then actually they can react because of anxiety. But if people who have a greater sense of purpose in their life are able to deal with anxiety differently, then I would want everybody in my church to know, what's your purpose right now? Where has God placed you? What does it mean to be a disciple, learning the way of Jesus in your place at this time? I think it would help with some of the issues that we face. And then finally, there were some really intriguing things for Pentecostals. Because we asked people, how often do you speak in tongues? Now, for those of us who are part of the Pentecostal charismatic world, then the gifts of the Spirit really matter. And when we ask people about the relationship between their purpose and their practice, well, for example, it didn't make any difference. The people who were really clear about purpose and those who were not clear about purposes, they pretty much, both of them made gathering on in worship a priority. But look at the difference in those who speak in tongues and know their purpose and those who don't. Now, it's not clear what the relationship is between these two things. It's not necessarily true that if you speak in tongues, you are more likely to have a sense of purpose. Nor is it exactly clear that if you have a real sense of purpose, you're more likely to speak in tongues. It's not that simple to make an equation, but there is some correlation. Look at, even more starkly, the people who said actually they use spiritual gifts. Half of the people who said, I know what my purpose is, believe that they use spiritual gifts really regularly. Wider than tongues, that would include prayer for healing, it would include prophecy, it would include words of knowledge or wisdom, deliverance, faith, all those gifts of the New Testament. If you're clear about your purpose, you're much more likely to have a context in which your spiritual gifts are used. Whereas if you're not clear about your purpose, maybe actually there's just no context that you're aware of. There's so much more that we could have spoken about from this research, but just 3 things today. The significance of small groups. It's hard to commit to being in a small group because it demands time. It demands a willingness to give up space in your diary. It can be hard to encourage people to join small groups, and it can feel like sometimes you're just banging the drum and no one's listening. But we know from this, and I know from other work I've done in other contexts, that actually being part of a small group, for those who do, they claim it makes all the difference in the world. We know that for half of the folks in the churches that we dealt with in Elim, their primary mission field is their workplace. We can help one another with that. We can help people get a vision for what God might be wanting to do in that workplace. We can help people understand what that might mean for them. And then finally, we've got a huge task. When we were born, God put his hand upon our lives and he called us to his kingdom, and he called us for a purpose. Our lives change as years go by. And at each stage, our prayer is, Lord, what do you want me to do here? What does it mean to learn your way in this context at this time? For if we know and we can own the context that we're in, then we are much more likely to live a fruitful, fulfilled, spirit-filled, spirit-engaged life. We know that because of what people told us. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.
So Neil, thank you so much for taking the time to unpack that research, to kind of get all of those 6 months of conversations and interactions into 20 or so minutes. Has been absolutely fantastic. And I know people will really appreciate it. So what we want to do in this time is just explore in a bit more detail, delve into some of those areas that you've managed to uncover as part of this process. So Neil, firstly, you're a busy pastor working in Salford. How on earth do you get the time to do all this work?
I think, the truth is I had a team. There was a team of people who did this work with me. I did most of it while I was still working for LICC, is the truth. But the point is actually it does take time to listen to people. But I think it's worth the effort, and I think it's worth the time because of what you discover.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was 3 strands really that came out that you wanted to draw our attention to. And the first one was the significance of small groups. The second one was the significance of our missional connections or connectedness to others. And then the final one was the significance of knowing our purpose. So let's deal with the first one first. Did it really take 6 months research to discover that small groups and discipleship go hand in hand?
I can't believe you're saying that about research. No, of course not. I think lots of us have believed for a long time that actually small groups are significant. I think what was particularly noteworthy for me was to hear the people who'd encountered small groups, or a certain type of small group actually, for the first time, and how that now was enabling them to articulate the significance of small groups for their own discipleship. I think they talked about discipleship, they talked about enabling the word to connect with their own wider lives, and they talked about accountability, and I felt quite movingly. And I think the challenge for those of us who are pastors is, how do we encourage people to engage in small groups? I think, when I talk to pastors and have done over the years, I'll ask, well, how do you think disciples are primarily formed? And they'll point to small groups, and then I'll ask them, how many people are in your small group? And they'll go, well, about a third to a half. And if I'm really feeling mean, I say, but how many turn up? But that's a different question. And then I'll ask, but how do you encourage people to join small groups? And they'll say, well, actually, we explain it's where they get cared for, it's where they get friends, it's where they get connected to. And it's perhaps no surprise that if you think discipleship and formation and transformation is going to happen in these groups, but then you sell them, as it were, on the basis of friendship, people go, well, I've got enough friends, I don't need any more friends. In fact, I've got so many friends and not enough time. I'm doing all I can to keep up with the ones I've got. I think that what we've got, and I think actually in lockdown we've got an interesting moment here. Someone said, and I read recently, that when you take away the problem of travel, when you take away the problem of, I don't want to come out because it's raining tonight, when you take out the fact is, I've got I'm just home from work and I've got to go out again. When you're not like that and you can do it all online, the only thing you're left with is, are you motivated enough to join a group of people who might actually enable you to be transformed?
And then it's a decision of, do I want to opt in or don't I want to opt in?
Exactly.
And equally, not just voting with our feet, but voting with our heart, or a desire to change in the process. Because you talk about a certain type of small group, and I'm assuming by that you mean in a vulnerability and openness and storytelling and sharing and learning from one another. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's so much more than information. Mm-hmm. I think, and this is where it can be quite tricky to find the right things that are going to help you, because a lot of the Bible study resources for small groups are essentially informational based.
Yeah.
Whereas actually what we're talking about is, where are we on this journey with Jesus? And what am I allowing you to hear? And what am I allowing you to speak into? And what am I willing to change, really?
Yeah. And that becomes an even more vulnerable place, I guess, for someone leading a small group, because it maybe accelerates or necessitates the need to ensure as church leaders we're training people to kind of create discipleship environments for people, rather than just an hour or an hour and a half of catching up and seeing how the week's been.
It was interesting that one of the churches that we did some of this research with, when the minister wanted to introduce small groups into their church, what he did was he led a small group for 18 months of the leaders that would then go on to lead the group, because he said, I wanted the DNA to be there.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not enough just to recruit leaders and then send them off. I think they need to feel it and experience it.
Yeah, it's the values and the culture that goes with it. And
yeah, absolutely.
Neil, then that community is essential then to discipleship. Would you go as far as to say that from the research?
I think, from the research, and also through, theological reflection. I mean, and this isn't profound or deep particularly, but it's worth just noticing that when Jesus begins by gathering people who would become the leaders of the church, who would, the mission to the Gentiles, he gets 12 people. He doesn't mentor one-to-one.
Yeah.
Individuals. He brings people together in community. And in that community, we see the best and the worst of them. Mm-hmm. And it's lived out in front of Jesus. And he's forming a community in a certain shape, a certain way, throughout his ministry period. And is that just incidental or coincidental? Or is that not a model, but is that suggestive of actually how you are shaped as an individual?
Yeah, and there's an intentionality in how we help each other become more like Jesus and walk in the ways of Jesus, not just kind of go to Jesus for our own encounter. You know, we can all look great in our own relationship with Jesus, but it's start to point out the faults and the failures and hold up the mirror, we realize challenges to work on.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think I'd be a great Christian if it's just me and Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go on then to the next section, Neil, about the connections or missional connections and the necessity for missional connectedness. And maybe more important, how we're equipping people to be ready in those spaces. It's not rocket science to recognize that once you've been a Christian for a few years, most of your significant relationships tend to be other Christians. It seems that in the research, people admitted that, and that bore itself out. But the contact with non-Christians primarily seems to be in the workplace. And that opens up for us a mission field in terms of our missional connection. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, you know, for most Christians, I think the two places where you are most likely to be living out your faith in a way that is observed over a long period of time is actually in your family or your extended family and the workplace.
Yeah.
And those are the places where people will observe how you live and your reactions and your actions over a long period of time. And I think if, you know, we asked about the workplace and, you know, they indicated that that was one of the places, unsurprisingly, where they're spending much of their time. And if you think about the workplace, if you work as part of a team or you're in a context, a school or a hospital where your colleagues are with you a lot of the time, you will spend more time with them than with your friends. You spend more time with them than actually, in some cases, you do with your spouse. And that sense of how do we enable people to get a confidence and an awareness? How do we minister to them if that's the primary mission field?
Yeah.
You know, for folks for whom, you know, people like me, I spend my workplace is the church. You know, I spend most of my hours with thinking about the church, thinking about Christians, but actually I'm preparing people for a place that's very different. What do I need to encounter for that to be the case?
Yeah. Well, when we talk about taking Jesus into our workplace then, you know, and being missional in those spaces, what do we mean by that in simple terms, Neil? You know, have we rehearsed the gospel sentences so we can kind of, you know, put them over at coffee break? You know, are there some basic things that we can be getting into the way that we work that just promote Jesus or put him at the forefront of our lives?
I think, I mean, you know, this is you know, there's any number of answers to this, isn't there? But, you know, I think that one of the things is, can you allow people to know who you are? That's fundamentally, can you let people understand who you are and what makes you tick and why it makes you tick? And secondly, can you communicate that in a language that they can hear?
Yeah.
I got a friend of mine who a number of years ago, she works in a university setting. It's really politically correct. It's very liberal. It's not particularly conducive to faith. And she saw a colleague coming down the corridor and he was really clearly, visibly upset. And as she met him, she asked him what was going on and they got talking. And then she asked him what I thought was a really intriguing question, but a really good question. She said, do you have any resources for days like this?
Well,
now, in her context, for her language, in her place, with her personality, that was her asking, how do you cope?
Yeah, help me.
And he said, I've got nothing for days like this. What do you have? And she said she would go and get a coffee, and she talked about prayer, and she talked about why that meant so much, and the relationship she had with God that lay behind that prayer. Now, she was not manipulating a conversation. She had a genuine care for a colleague.
Yeah.
And she was willing to notice and she was willing to stop. And then she was willing to ask him a question that wasn't, do you know Jesus is your personal savior? But it was, how do you what resources do you have for this? And that allowed him to be vulnerable and a conversation to develop. Now, that flows out of who she is, and a confidence about who she is, and a sort of like being willing to talk about her faith in a way that can be understood.
And so it's really interesting when we get to this missional connection idea then, Neil, because so often we look at discipleship as post-conversion. You know, someone's made the decision to follow Jesus. So my focus as a disciple maker is on somebody who's now walking in the ways of Jesus. But this is starting to open up opportunities where we see disciple making as helping people into that decision to follow Jesus. You know, so maybe there's a both and an awareness of a broader, more holistic discipleship that relates to mission. Would that be fair? Or
I think so. I think it. I don't know what you think about this, but I think it's almost like allowing people to see what faith looks like. It's like show, don't tell. And I think that much of our evangelism has been a feeling that somehow we've got to go and persuade as though it's an intellectual blockage that gets in the way. And sometimes there's no doubt that for some people there are genuine questions that need to be engaged with. But actually, I think what people are really interested in, what does a life of integrity look like? What does a life look like that is built around this? Does this faith look credible and plausible? And I think that's what my friend was doing when she said, well, for me, this is how my faith works out on days like this.
How does what you believe in Jesus affect how you live, how you think, you act? Yeah.
And how do you parent? How do you deal with ambition? How do you deal with financial pressure? How do you deal with fear? How do you deal with illness? And I think that when that becomes the basis, then what we're saying to people, because it's true, is, yeah, we have those days as well.
Yeah. So therefore, there will be an argument for us to consider as church leaders, how do we prepare people for those missional connections?
Yeah.
How preparing people in church to live out their faith in the real world every day, all day. So, Neil, let me go on to the last kind of area, which was exploring this whole area of purpose. I could see the excitement in your face when you were presenting to us that there was almost a discovery. And when you do a piece of research, it's nice when you have those moments where you stumble across something that you weren't expecting to find. And it was the whole idea of significance and relationship between knowing our purpose and being a disciple. Could you just expand on that a little bit for us and help us understand what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, the reason, and I was, I'm glad you spotted the excitement. I think what we found was, we were asking a whole stack of questions, and the research is much wider than those three areas, by the way. There's much more there, and we were asking many more detailed questions. But along the way, we asked questions of how confident are you about knowing what the purpose of God is for your life at this moment? And we had 830 people filled out these responses. And about roughly 270 of them said, yeah, really confident.
Yeah.
And 270 went, yeah, kind of. And about the same number said, not at all. Not at all. Now, these were people in really good churches. They were people who were really committed to their churches. They were people who were willing to do a survey. There were people who were willing to engage and identify with Christ. And yet a third of them, 270 people, were going, I don't really know why I'm here.
Oh.
Now, just on a human level, forget anything else for a moment, you kind of want everybody with a pulse to know why they were created, why they're on the earth, and what their contribution is.
Absolutely.
And pastorally, I'm kind of thinking, and I did think, I mean, this was literally going through my head, I wonder if there's a third of folks in my own church community who are saying, well, I don't know either. Now, I might have done before, I might do again, but right now I have no idea. And so I began to think through and ask, then interrogate that finding against other things that they'd said. And it was genuinely intriguing to find that they said, actually, we're more anxious than people who feel really confident that they know their purpose. We're more fearful. We feel less fruitful in our life with God. Now, of course, you might sit there and go, well, yeah, of course. But actually, for people to give you that evidence,
yeah,
I found really quite powerful.
Yeah. And so then as we uncover that, if people understand their purpose, they're more likely to work out their faith and walk in the ways of Jesus, and I suppose deal with some of the challenges that life brings them. Is that what you're saying? You know, or how do we help people know their purpose in order to walk in the ways of Jesus?
I think, by the way, there's the title of a really good book knocking around here that, you know, but maybe it's been done before. I think what happens is that people need to know, I mean, this is stuff that we say constantly, but people don't need to identity in Christ. Who am I? Pardon me. But then to be able to answer, why am I here? And I think that we've done a lot of good work on who are you in Christ. But actually, the why am I here is not a general answer.
Yeah.
And in many ways, my answer of why I am here will not be the same as your answer, because we've got different responsibilities.
Yeah.
We're at different stages of life. We have different callings. We have different giftings. We have different opportunities. And it might be that I can work it out on my own, but I suspect that where I grow most confident about purpose is where someone sits with me and says, can I help?
Yeah.
I think it has to be like that. And I think that when that happens, it gives a sense of, okay, not only do I know why I'm here, but I know I'm going to keep on going. Now, where we've been really good at this in church, I think, is we've been really good when people felt called to Christian ministry. And we talk a lot about the call, and the call will keep you. And, you know, even through the hardest days, you sense of call, and so you're going to carry on. Well, I want that for everyone. Not just those of us who are in Christian ministry, but for all of us who are in ministry, wherever that might be, whatever that ministry might look like, or whatever age we're at. I'm going to start singing a chorus in a minute, and you can come to the front for prayer, because I feel it's so significant.
Yeah. And our responsibility then as church leaders and pastors to maybe take less attention off the symptoms and more attention on the cause might be an interesting approach for us to take, because I think it was quite fascinating that, you know, issues around anxiety and fear and were heightened amongst people who didn't know what their purpose was.
Yeah, I want to be careful. I don't want to say that every cause of anxiety is because you don't know your purpose. That clearly isn't true. But I think that if people who feel purposeless feel more anxious, then let's deal with the purpose. It's kind of interesting in lockdown. For some people in lockdown, they are actually working harder and in more complex and more stressful contexts than they ever were before. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of the population who actually are now at this stage in lockdown. We're recording this on the 1st of May, and we're going, actually, we don't want to live like this because we feel it's purposeless.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the reason we keep on being reminded, stay at home, save the NHS, help one another, is because someone is trying to give us a purpose when we feel purposeless.
Yeah.
Now, if any of us know how that feels right now because of lockdown, can you imagine going through a lot of your life with that feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. And so not just clinging on to that kind of corporate purpose that we're all called to go and make disciples, but coming before God and coming alongside each other and say, well, God, what is my purpose in the situation, the context that I find myself in right now?
Yeah, where have you placed me? Who is with me? What have you called me to do? Who am I? And what have you gifted me with? And in a sense, what can I offer you?
Yeah.
And it's almost, I've got a suspicion that for some people, it's not so much can we help you discover your purpose, but can we enable you to see that what you're doing
has purpose.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So, Neil, just quickly, how would this change our practice as church leaders? Are there some practical things that we should be thinking about, or are there any other reflections on the research that you just wanted to kind of bring in just to kind of conclude our conversation together?
I think, as a pastor who's looked at this stuff and reflected on it, just these three areas, it's given me a renewed confidence, a renewed impetus to enable people to connect. I think it's easier to gather a group of people who retain anonymity than it is to create a community.
Yeah.
And I think that work on small groups certainly did that for me. I think the missional connections has made me think, okay, so how do I ensure that I keep on asking the good questions about where are you and how can I, there's a sort of a phrase that when it was used first was a really fresh phrase, and it became almost like a cliche about servant leadership.
Yeah.
Servant leaders. And it strikes me that the fundamental thing about being a servant is a servant asks, how can I help?
That's true. Yeah.
And I want to be that sort of servant leader who says, where are you and can I help at all? And a leader who is attuned enough to that sense of, can I help you find out why your life is significant?
Yeah.
And there are other things in the research, and they're for another day, but those three, if I took seriously those three, they would shape my ministry for the next coming years.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Neil. And just as you were speaking there, I was thinking about the temptation for the church leader to be a volunteer recruiter. Come and help me do what I'm doing, as opposed to a missionary mobilizer. How can I mobilize you to be a missionary where you are? And of course there's crossover and it's both and, but we must as leaders be looking to where people are already missionaries and helping to equip them and mobilize them where they are, as well as doing things together in community. So Neil, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the wider work that you've done. And I know that as people have engaged with this, that they'll be inspired not only to think more about their own practice, but to see how it can impact their church and hopefully transform their own discipleship journey too. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity just to explore it a bit further. Appreciate it.
No problem.
I hope you found this session informative and provoking as you consider afresh some of the key principles of disciple making. When Jesus commissioned his followers to go and make disciples, it was a clear invitation to purpose. The followers of Jesus were being confronted with their responsibility to replicate followers of Jesus wherever they went. Even more fascinating were the specific words of Jesus, as you go. Perhaps this reminds us that the very act of going, we get to participate in the purpose of Christ in our world. And together we can come to work out what that looks like in our context. Today you've been offered the invitation to make discipleship a priority. I want to finish today with a challenge. What is going to change in your life? What's going to change in your ministry to make discipleship your first priority? Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.